It's Radio Free 501c, the podcast of Rogue Tulips Consulting. I'm your host, Cecilia Sapp, and we're so excited to be back for Season 6 and continue bringing you outstanding ideas and thought leaders and different ways of thinking. So don't forget to subscribe because you're not going to want to miss any of it. This week I'm joined by Ross Heller. He's the founder of USAE News, and we're having a conversation about his long career. It's August 26, 2024. Welcome to episode 252. Hey everybody, it's Monday, August 26th. Can you believe summer's almost over? I certainly can't, even though I've been living in the basement the last 3 months. But I'm glad that you're here with us this week for a Radio Free 501c. I'm your host, Cecilia Sapp. I'm the principal and founder of Rogue Tulips Consulting, and I'm a CAE and an ACNP. I want to thank everybody for joining us this week. If you haven't subscribed yet or followed us yet on your favorite podcast service, please do so you don't miss any of our exciting episodes. We've shown staying power this year at hitting episode 250 a few weeks ago, so I hope you'll join us going forward. This week, I'm very excited to welcome Ross Heller, who is a legend in our profession. He's the founder of USAE News. And if you don't know about USAE News, you really should, because it's basically the paper of record for nonprofit organization management, and especially in the area of meetings and conferences. Ross, I am so excited that you're here and that we've got to meet recently. So would you like to say hello to our audience and tell them a little about yourself?
Good morning and hello. I'm Ross Heller. I founded USAE in 1982. It's hard to believe. Wow. It's 42 years. In fact, it'll be 42 years September 12th, if I'm remembering correctly. We started, my late wife, Ann Daly Heller, and I started USAE on that date, and it was one day after USA Today published its first issue. And I'm glad to say that in our first 10 years or so, they lost only, I think, $100 million. We actually turned a profit. So we've been both going strong for 42 plus years and have every intention of continuing to go strong.
That is fantastic. I did not know that. That is a fun piece of trivia to know. And fortunately, you're still here too, and you're making money. That's fantastic. Before we start our conversation, though, I would like to remember to say good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to our global audience, wherever you may be joining us from. So, Ross, I think one of the things that would be a great question to start with is, why did you start USAE News? And then what impact have you seen it have on the profession over the last 40 years?
Well, for the 12 years prior to starting USAE, I was an association executive up until 1980. I left my association executive job because I didn't have the opportunity to become a CEO, and I felt I could do more. And so while I was an association executive, and I had seen a service that published convention daily newspapers. And I said, that could be something I could do. And I ended up having a wonderful chat with the late Mickey Gorman, who was the CEO of the Greater Washington Society of Association Executives, which many of your readers or listeners might be aware of, just since gone out of business. But Mickey Gorman and I had a nice chat, I think somewhere around Easter of 1979. And he said, I think your convention newspaper idea is a terrific one. Would you like to do one for springtime in the park? And I had early on learned the most important sales axiom, which is always take yes for an answer. I said, Mickey, I'd be delighted. And so I managed to learn some of the formula that you needed to do, which was to sell advertising to the supplier community. And all of a sudden, people started buying ads in my springtime convention newspaper. And we gave it out at springtime in 1979. And I remember my boss at the time picking up a copy. And he said, did you do this, Ross? I said, as a matter of fact, I did. And I never looked back. And I gave him my notice. And I started work on October 1st, 1979, publishing convention newspapers. A couple of years later, I was in New Orleans, staying in a wonderful hotel in the quarter called Place d'Armes, and doing a convention newspaper for a client that I had no idea what their subject matter was. It was so obscure to me, but nevertheless, I was able to get something produced. And I woke up in the middle of the night and I said to my wife, I said, I think we should start publishing a newspaper for the association community. I know there's advertising there and there's always plenty of news. And she said, Ross, go back to bed. We'll talk about it in the morning. So this was in January of 1982. And we did talk about it in the morning and kind of wrote down some notes. And lo and behold, we published our first newspaper, September 12, 1982. And we have been publishing ever since. Initially, we called it Washington Association Executive. It was published every other week, and it was sent at no charge to a mailing list we created. Over the years, we changed our formula a bit and decided that it was good to send it out to association execs nationwide. And so we did. And then we decided it was appropriate to start charging subscriptions. So we put out a notice that it was no longer free. And imagine that, people actually paid. So we had revenue coming in besides from advertising. And then a couple of years later, I guess it was, we decided to go weekly. And we've been weekly ever since. So that's where USAE got its birth, as it were.
Well, and you have mentioned so many things that are part of my early career: GWSAE, USAE News, of course, I've always known about it. Springtime in the Park, which unfortunately left us many years ago as well. And one of the reasons I was so excited that you agreed to be on Radio Free 501c is because you know so much about our history in the association world. And as we're continuing to evolve in the 21st century. Now, you've covered a lot of news stories in the association world. And I know you and I, when we were talking a couple weeks ago on our way back or to and back from Cleveland, you shared a lot of good stories. But what are some stories you think would be of interest to the broader audience? Like something, I know it's like, we've got to be careful. You can't name names.
There's lots of good stuff. I'm going to tell a cute story, but I want to say that having a feuds has been a theme of a lot of them. But this particular cute story I'm going to tell you has nothing to do with a feud. Many of your people in your audience might be familiar with the term fam trips that association executives frequently find themselves invited on to see sites and meeting places and the like. Anne and my late wife, Anne, who's the principal of most of these good stories, and I had the opportunity to go in the 1990s, to several Miss America pageants in Atlantic City. And I don't know how many of your audience had ever been to a Miss America pageant, but they held it in that wonderful boardwalk hall that actually was similar to the convention site that ASAE had for its general sessions in Cleveland. So Boardwalk Hall was the site of Miss America. And part of the Miss America pageant every year is a parade where down the boardwalk. And all the Miss America women ride in convertible cars, and the parade audience all shouts to them, "Show me your shoes." And the ladies all wear fancy, crazy shoes, because that's part of the pageant tradition. And they will raise their leg and show their shoes. Well, we were at this Miss America event in the 1990s, and they had invited us, the pageant people or the CVB folks had invited us to a dinner the night before. And so I found myself sitting with two former Miss Americas, and I'd been a Miss America fan since the 1950s. I just loved watching Miss America. So going to Miss America was on my personal bucket list. So I'm sitting next to two Miss Americas from the 50s, a lady named, Evelyn I don't know her married name now, and a lady named, whose name was Lee Merriweather. These were both Miss America winners from long ago. So we're sitting there and we're chatting at dinner, around a table of 10. And I got talking to her, I guess it was Lee Merriweather, about the parade and how much fun it was. And we were talking about show me your shoes. And she said, well, here's the real story about show me your shoes. I said, oh, you've got to tell me. She said, well, the tradition got started somewhere in the 50s when the parade was taking place. And quite a few of the revelers who were watching the parade had had more than their share of beer and such like that. And they started yelling at the girls, "Show me your boobs." Well, of course, they couldn't possibly do that.
Oh, no.
So they raised their legs and showed their shoes. And ever since, they've been showing their shoes. And that's how that story got started.
Oh, wow. What a fun story. I love that. And associations always have traditions like that too. So hearing a fun story like that. And for you classic TV fans out there, Lee Merriweather is that Lee Merriweather, the actress. And
Was she really?
yeah, she was wonderful. She's best known for Barnaby Jones, most likely, and his astute daughter-in-law. So that's a great story. Now, Ross, you've mentioned your late wife Anne several times, and
Yes.
you knew what an excellent reporter she was, and she was so good at finding stories. What do you think made her such a great reporter?
She was several things. She was very aggressive. She never wanted to sort of just let things lie. She always wanted to know what was happening and the story behind the story. And she loved to gossip. And she had, 4 or 5 or 6 girlfriends and guy friends in the industry that she would just talk to incessantly. And they were always telling her stuff. And then once she heard something, she just would never quit until she got the answer. And so that's where some of these wonderful feuds started, because people would tell her stuff. And then she wanted to know, well, what's the real story? So, for example, these days we are wonderful, good friends with what's now called Destination DC. Way back then, it was the Washington, D.C. Convention and Business Bureau. And the leadership back in the 80s was not anywhere near as enlightened as the current leadership. And they particularly didn't like the stories that Anne was writing. And this was in the 80s was when the very first convention center got built, the one that has been since torn down, built up fancy shops, and they got a brand new one. But back in the 80s, the old one was the brand new one. And there had been a report published that was saying that the CVB hadn't done a terrifically good job of filling it up about 5 years beyond its opening date. I think this is something like that. And so the guy who was the boss at the time had gotten a report about this. Well, Anne, of course, had heard about it. I'd say, of course, from talking to her friends, she'd heard about it. And so she asked for a copy, and they said, "Oh, we can't give you that." Well, of course, when someone told her she couldn't have it, of course, she wanted it. And so she talked to everybody she knew, and even put out a thing that said to the reporters that the first reporter could get a copy, they'd get $100 reward from her. So one afternoon, she told me to go to the Shoreham Hotel, and there'd be an envelope waiting at the front desk, a brown envelope with her name on it. So I went to the Shoreham, picked it up. Well, sure enough, there it was. She had it here. Well, this happened, I guess, in 1983, because ASAE had its spring convention, its very first spring convention that year. And we were looking for content because we sold a lot of ads, which was very nice. And so she realized this report was fabulous content because it was just legitimate and it was long and it filled up lots of pages. So we printed every word. Well, they were so angry. The guy that was the boss there. Can I tell you his name or not? I don't know.
Well, that's up to you, because if he's still alive, he might come back to you.
His name was Austin Kenny. I think he's Austin was very unhappy. So that's the way it was. And he was so angry that he told people on his staff that anybody who read USAE would get fired. So about that too, but there was nothing we could do. Well, when he eventually retired, let me find my note. When he eventually retired, they did a retirement banquet for him. And if I'm remembering the story right, Anne was told by one of her friends that she was uninvited. She was not allowed to go to the retirement banquet.
Wow.
Yes. So, notwithstanding, she sent one of her girl reporters, and we covered the whole thing. Well, at the retirement banquet, it turned out they'd given him an automobile as a gift.
Wow.
And yes. And not only that, did he get a gift, a car, but there was money left over. So they gave him that too. We also published that in the paper, and he wasn't happy about that at all. So uh, he got succeeded by a fellow named Dan Mobley, and I think Dan's still around. And Dan sort of took the word, took his Dan was his acolyte, and took what his attitude that his boss had, and didn't like us either, and told his bosses that nobody was supposed to ever read USAE. But then somebody told us one day they'd seen him reading the paper and tucking it in his desk drawer, so no one would know that he'd read. Oh, we did all that.
So you've broken a lot of stories at USAE News, and I remember you telling me you would print the story even if you knew somebody would get angry. So that's a great example of that. And I know you mentioned you had some feuds with people. I don't know if you want to share another feud story.
Oh yes, so I'll continue. So this guy, when Dan Mobley was the boss, they used to do this because he was a New Orleans guy, and they used to do. He used to do a party every year at the PCMA convention called the Ragin' Cajun Party, and it was a big deal to get invited to Dan's party. Well, of course, he never invited us, but one year, and this was at the Lowe's Coronado Hotel, um, we found out where it was going to be, and we visited with the chef and got ourselves a picture of the chef. And then we got thrown out of that as well from the kitchen because they didn't like us breaking in on their party. So,
Oh my gosh.
yeah, well, this stuff goes on. I mean, these feuds are just sort of part of it, and just the way it is. Um, we and always felt it was important to write the story. If it was news and it was true, we wrote it.
So what are some other big stories that USAE News has broken over the years?
Well, back in the GWSAE days, when Steve Carey was the boss, and he had taken this, he had announced that he was taking the job at the what was then known as the International Association of Convention and Visitor Bureaus. Uh, they had they'd been managed, IACVB had been managed by a management company in, where was it? Champaign, Illinois. But the powers that be at IACVB decided they wanted to run themselves, and they didn't want a management company anymore. So they, and they decided to hire Steve because they knew him so well because they were all his clients at GWSAE. He'd sold tons of ads to them and sponsorships and you name it. And so he knew these guys really well. And so they hired him to be the new CEO. Well, the question then was who's going to be the CEO of GWSAE because Steve has left. And of course, Steve didn't want to tell us. Nobody wanted to tell us that. Anne wanted to, and when she couldn't be told, she wanted to find out. And so she doped out that it was going to be Susan Sarfati, who at that time was working for ASAE as their director of education, meeting planner, and whatever. And figured out it was really good to be Susan got the job. And so comes the springtime in the park event, and they'd still not announced it. And Ann and I are sitting at that time, they always had a luncheon banquet before the afternoon event. Well, we were there a little bit early in the luncheon banquet. And then Susan comes in because she's coming as a ASAE, what she is. And Ann walked up to Susan and said, so I understand you're going to be the new boss at GWSAE. Well, Susan's voice said no, but Susan's look said yes. I mean, there was no question about it that Susan had the job. So Ann went with that story, and of course she was right. Susan was announced as the new head several days later. That's just kind of she was an exceptional reporter.
Well, and I'm going to interrupt you there about GWSAE. So when GWSAE and ASAE merged, for those of you who may not know exactly what GWSAE is, it's the Greater Washington Society of Association Executives, and it was
It doesn't exist anymore.
Oh no, it's gone now, but
yeah.
It was a group in the DC area, and you could belong to that and ASAE, or just one or the other. You didn't have to belong to both, but many years ago they merged, which is why there is no GWSAE anymore. So how did you cover that story, the merger?
We covered it very straight. We covered all the sessions and events and the election, and we didn't take an editorial position. Personally, I felt it was a terrible thing to happen. GWSAE at the time was 75 years old, and
Wow.
it was thriving. It was doing very, very well. It had a healthy magazine that was a competitor of ours. It had an incredible trade show that was very, very popular called Springtime in the Park. It had a terrific program that its foundation ran called the Speakers Series that they brought in very well-known speakers to the Kennedy Center, and they did, I don't know, 5 a year, I guess, and it was a fundraising thing for the GWSA Foundation. But for whatever reason, they decided that they were better together. That was the slogan that GWSA and ASA pitched, and they managed to get 75% of the membership said we should dissolve. That's what the bylaws required, and they did. They merged.
Well, I agree with you. I always thought that was a mistake because it took away an option for people, and it was a little bit smaller. It was a little bit smaller community, in my opinion. It was a little easier to get involved. And they did have a lot of high quality things. So I agree with you. And I remember when they used to have that big space over at the Reagan International Center,
Yes.
sponsored by Marriott Corporation. And that was a great place to have events. And their office was there. So it just really a lot of great stuff came out of that. And then I remember as an ASAE member, there was a lot of confusion after the merger because there was two of everything. Two directors of membership, two directors of research, et cetera. And so you weren't quite sure who was doing what. And it took them several years to figure that out, but they did.
That was a very fraught subject for me, personally at the time. But from kind of a business perspective, it made one less competitor for our newspaper's advertising, so that was good. But yet, and from ASAE's perspective, I think it was worth everything that they had to do because they put a competitor of their magazine out of business, and they acquired this wonderful trade show that was very, very profitable. So there are obviously reasons why it got done, and the membership agreed. So that was it.
Let's talk a little bit about Springtime in the Park, because that used to be the event of the year, especially for conference planners and CBB. So I've never quite understood why that went away. They did change the name at one point to Springtime, because I remember going when they called it Springtime. But do you have any insight on how that decision got made?
No. I think it had, well, initially Springtime in the Park was held at the hotel that is now no longer in business, the Marriott Wardman Park, which back then was known as the Sheraton. But one of the things that ASAE did when they took it over was they moved it kind of logically, I think, to the Washington Convention Center. And it was a good event there. I kind of think that it just ran its course.
Yeah.
ASAE felt that maybe it was a little bit too competitive with their annual meeting. I don't know. But eventually it just, everything has like the Bible says, there's a time for everything under heaven. And perhaps it's ran its course.
Yeah, and things have changed. Yeah, and I remember going to it at the convention center when they had rebranded it Springtime. And yes, and I have fond memories of going to events at what used to be the Sheraton up in Upper Washington by the National Zoo. That was a great space.
Yes.
I don't even know what they've done with it now. I don't even know if it's a hotel or if they turned it into condos. I don't even.
It's, as far as I know, like you said, it's being converted into something else.
Yeah.
It is no longer a hotel. The pandemic did it in, unfortunately.
Oh, that's a shame. That's a beautiful building.
Yes. Yeah. Now there's still part of it that was a condo right from the get-go. The oldest part was built, I think, in the 1940s. And so it is a very high-priced place to live, but everything else is being turned into other things. And they have a lot of property. So Anne was an exceptional reporter. and she was always really, she had wonderful contacts out in the world of the association community. She broke this great story about this lady who was the chairman of the Bill Clinton grand jury. Do you know that story?
No.
No. Well, one afternoon we got a call at the office from this lady, and she said, I'm a subscriber, and I won't mention her name, but we put it in the paper. Uh, she said, I'm a subscriber, but unfortunately I can't pay my subscription anymore because I've been fired by my job, and I can't even apply to anything for unemployment or anything. I said, so the reporter said, well, tell us your story. She said, well, I'm the chairman of the Bill Clinton grand jury, and I work for the Madison Hotel as a sales director. And my boss fired me because I had so much time that I had to spend on my public duties that I couldn't work at the job. And I'm now, yes, and I'm now suing him for firing me. But the court has put my lawsuit on hold because I'm the foreman of the grand jury. So I said, great story. So we got all the information and we published it right away. We put it out sort of that it would get picked up by both the Associated Press and whatever other news services were there, because this was a terrific story. And it did get picked up. It got on the front page of the Washington Post. The New York Times ran a little blurb about it, about this lady. And eventually she was able to get her money back. But this was a great story that we broke that had some national implications, as it were. Good stuff.
And you also helped someone in the process, which I think is great journalism, not just good journalism. So speaking of stories, you had a couple samples you brought for visuals today. You had a couple stories that you wanted to feature. And for those of you who are listening, we will describe what Ross is showing us on the screen. So Ross has here a USAE newspaper headline, National Tragedy.
Yes.
I cannot read the date, but Ross is going to tell us the story behind that. So it's one of their front.
This issue was published September 18, 2001. We go to press on a Thursday, and our date of issue is always Monday or Tuesday. These days it's Monday. It might have been Tuesday way back then. So what?
I was just laughing because
we came to the office on September 11th, and everybody knows what happened on September 11th. And it was horrible for everybody. We had a brief, we all came to work. We stayed for about 2 hours and just sort of talked about everything we'd seen and heard, and said, well, we obviously have to do something. And what are we going to do? And then we decided that we would, how we'd break up the coverage and such. And then everybody went home. The next day we all came back in and dug into work. And so we had one reporter was covering the hotel aspect, because there was a Marriott hotel that was burned, that was part of the tragedy there in New York at the World Trade Center. And then there was, the transportation, everything just ground to a halt. There was all these different issues. And so one reporter covered the association meetings aspect of it. One covered the New York hotel part of it. Somebody else covered all the convention bureaus, how they were affected by all this. And that was our story. We then had to have, what kind of picture should we run? And so the photo that we ended up running was from attendees at the Jane's Facility Security Conference in Salt Lake City bow their heads in silence in response to the terrorism attacks. It was the kind of picture that we thought.
Yeah, if you're listening, it's a photo of people taking a moment of silence and praying after the September 11th, 2001 attack. That is a really historic moment captured by USAE News, as well as all of our other news sources.
Our headlines, for those who couldn't see it, the lead headline is just 2 words: national tragedy. And then the second lead was meetings industry grieves, responds to crisis. And then one story was association offices destroyed in World Trade Center collapse. Another one was meetings, conventions postponed, canceled in wake of tragedy. And then the third one was New York and DC hotels evacuated, some turned into shelters. And plenty of as much coverage as we could get. Back in those days, and this is kind of an interesting we produced our paper in Washington, D.C. We had our own graphics department, and we had CompuGraphic machines, which is the typesetting machines they had back before we had what we have these days. Then we would print out the content. We would run it through a waxing machine. Back in the day, you had a wax machine that waxed the copy that you then pasted down on blue grid sheets. Today, of course, all that's gone with the wind. And then we had to take the paper, these large flats that was the size of the paper itself, to National Airport. And at National Airport, we would always take the last shuttle, the last Delta Airlines flight to Atlanta. Those days, and still today, Delta runs quite a few flights from DCA National Airport to Atlanta. And back then, all you had to do was drive up to the air cargo door, walk in, give it to the lady, say, here it is. And we were such good customers, they knew us by name. And as long as we got there by, I guess, 7:30 in the evening, it would get on the 8:30 flight to Atlanta. And then our printer was located in Georgia. They had a truck that came and picked up the artwork, took it to their plant, printed it, shipped it to the post office the next day. So not only everything else, but we had to get this to the paper, to the airport by 7:30, and it was always a very close thing. We would drive through Rockbridge Park to the airport and could make it usually in about 35 minutes at that time of day. But I can remember driving there, and had to be there by 7:30 because that's when the air freight people needed this stuff. So
wow, that's a very different way of doing things. And I remember how it was very different to print things 30 years ago. We're so used to on demand now. And even me, I don't think about it. My father was even a journeyman pressman, and he used to work on those printers that were as big as a house.
Right. Well, our printer, we printed the paper back then, heat set web offset on a high grade newsprint. Then over the years, we decided to upgrade the quality of the paper because we were selling a lot of 4-color advertising, and 4-color advertising looked better on a white sheet rather than a newsprint sheet. And then I guess it was about 10 years ago, the printer called me and said, Ross, we bought ourselves a digital press. I said, what's that? And he said, it's kind of like your digital printer at home, but bigger. But the interesting thing is, if you let us print your USAE newspaper on our digital press, I can save you a lot of money. I said, oh, tell me about that. He said, well, the newspaper would have to be a little smaller in dimension because the digital press is not quite as big as your tabloid sheet. But on the other hand, you were paying $2,000 a month, $2,000 a week to print your USAE newspaper on our heat set web press. I can print the same paper for $800. I said, when can we start? And we've been printing on the digital press ever since. So
yeah, who wouldn't say that though? But you're making me wax nostalgic, Ross, for all those things that we don't do anymore. Like I actually remember mimeograph machines.
I remember those.
Yeah, and they smelled good. I don't know what it was about that fluid, but they smelled good. And at my work study job in college, that was one of my jobs, as I would run off things on the mimeograph machine.
Well, back before I was an adult, and I was just an old teen, I was a counselor at a summer camp, and I was responsible for doing the camp's newspaper, and we did it on a mimeograph machine.
So you've always been doing newspapers. You've always been involved.
I have. It's very, very interesting. You wonder, how did your career start? And I was in high school, and I was on the high school newspaper for 2 years, I guess. And I graduated high school only at 16 and a half, but I'd written for the high school newspaper. And there I remember you had to learn that, unlike today, you can write any headline you want and make it fit. Well, back then you had to count the words, and they had to count. M's counted as 2, I's counted as, I think, half. Other letters were 1, and there was depending on how wide your paper was, you had a count that you had to make the headline fit. And if it didn't fit, the teacher would throw it out to write a better headline to make it fit the space. But I did that for 2 years, give or take. And then when I was in college, I wrote for my college newspaper and didn't think anything of it. It's just what I did. I wrote sports stuff because I was on the college rowing team. And so I covered the rowing team and sports things, and occasionally feuded a bit with the editors about the stuff that they were writing. But then I graduated, or I was about to graduate as a senior, and they had, as they do at college now, I'm sure, recruiters that came to your school. And I ended up being recruited by the Providence Journal newspaper in Providence, Rhode Island. And to me, it was just a nice job. But I'd had that job for 2 years, and then I went off to the University of Oregon in Eugene, Oregon, and got my master's degree in journalism. It was kind of like a sabbatical before you needed a sabbatical. I quit my job, went to school for a year, and then back into work again. But so newspapers really have been part of my life ever since I was a young teenager, but I didn't realize it at the time. That was just sort of my career path.
It's interesting when you do look back as a grown-up and see what influenced you to take your career path. I was talking with somebody recently about the impact of playing team sports on how I developed as a professional, because it teaches you that you can do more than you think you can, and it instills a lot of confidence. So when you look back on that, and I also always loved to write like you, and I've been involved in a lot of newsletters over the years. Although it's always been part of my job in the association world. I never worked at a newspaper like you did, but I think that would be fun. But Ross, one of the things I'm curious to hear from your perspective is, after covering the association world for so many years, knowing so many people, so many of the events that shaped us and where we are now, what do you think has been the biggest change in the association world?
Well, I think a couple of things. For women, for sure, there's a lot more women involved in association executives than there were, I think, in the 80s and 90s, and that's a very, very good thing. That's one thing. I think another thing is the issue of diversity. That we're seeing a lot more diversity of people of color, people of Asian background, people of every kind of ethnicity. Back in the day when I started USAE, it was very much when I started USAE and covering ASAE particularly, because I've been an ASAE member since 1970. Wow. It's a long time. Yes. And back then, ASAE was really a very quintessential old boys club. I think there's no other way to describe it. It was led by a guy named James P. Lowe, who was helped develop the CAE program. And he was a real dynamo and a real dynamic guy. And but everybody who was in leadership was, one of his buddies. And I think the number of members that ASAE had was, mostly all men. They finally had a woman president, I think in 1982, was their very, very first woman president, if I remember correctly. Because we wrote about her in our very first issues that we published. We did a nice story about who she was. But I mean, she was the exception, hardly the exception and not the rule. I mean, they finally in the 90s and beyond, more and more women got involved as leadership of ASAE. But the woman who was the head in 1982, the chairman of the board, that was the very first woman chairman of the board they had.
Wow.
And so that's, and then of course, ASAE has changed its membership rules, I think, for the better, in that it used to be, I think you had to be either a CEO or a C-suite type person, and you were the member of ASAE from your association. I believe now the way they've opened the leadership, the membership is associations can join and give many of their staff, if they want, some kind of membership. Am I correct? You might know better than me.
Oh yeah, actually anybody who works in the association profession can join ASAE. They just have a few categories now. They have association staff, and they have consultant, and they have industry partner. They also have options, I believe, for retired people if they want to maintain their membership.
So
it is much broader. And building on what you said about the original membership model, a lot of people complain about that with the CAE program, because it used to be the CAE was only for C-suite people. Nobody else could even take the exam. And now I think it's better because, like the membership, it's more open, and anyone who qualifies for the certification exam can take it. So you don't have to be in the C-suite. And I think that's a good development because we're teaching the younger generations more about the profession and how to be a better leader, right, and about our body of knowledge, because we are actually a profession that stands on its own, even though a lot of people don't know that. So that's really, but what have you seen? A lot of what you've covered and focused on over the years has been conferences and meetings and event destinations. So what have you seen change a lot in the conference area?
Well, the ASE always had a lot of pizzazz, and I think it still does. You go to the convention, it has a lot of pizzazz. And one of the things that I think ASE sort of has made a hallmark of itself is they're not afraid to make a mistake. Mm-hmm. They would try new things in their conferences. And if they were successful, then they built on it, and their members would steal the idea. And I think that was the idea. But if something didn't work, well, it didn't work. So I think it might have been in the 90s, ASA decided one year to have a meeting in Europe. They had they met, I think, in Paris and somewhere in Germany or something, two different, and they had a train ride across to get there. Well, that concept never worked, so they never did it again. But they weren't, I think ASA wasn't afraid, and I think even today, they're not afraid to try new things, mm-hmm, and to make as innovative as they can in the staging and particularly in the exhibit and the way they serve food. It's there's nothing wrong in ASA's I think from ASA's context in failing.
Right.
I mean, if you fail, well, you tried something that didn't work, and your members will learn as well. That's not something we should do.
Well, I know I agree with you. I've been to a lot of ASAE annual meetings over the years. I've been a member since 1994 consistently. I've never dropped my membership. So I've seen it all happening in real time. But I do agree with you. They are willing to try something different with meetings and events. And there's only been one annual meeting that I thought, wow, this meeting's kind of a dud. And it was like the last time they were in Los Angeles, because they had gotten feedback people wanted more time for networking. Mm-hmm. And what they did is they left a big hole in the middle of the day. It was like 4 hours with no sessions, no events. And everybody's kind of wandering around. What are we supposed to do right now? And I said, well, I'm told we're supposed to network. And it's like, but for 4 hours, what are we going to do? And they never did that again. They take the comments to heart, and they really do a nice event. The one thing they seem to still have trouble with, and I saw this in Cleveland recently, is they still cannot seem to get the lunch in the exhibit hall right. They try every year. They try it a little different. They're always tweaking it. And I don't know why. It just never seems to work. But I say, keep trying ASAE so that we get some food in the exhibit hall. But I love their exhibit hall. I think it's great. And they always have great events like, the classic, and lots of receptions and things like that. So, and they're always trying to adjust and do something a little different. I always love that. But is there anything that you think in the association community we should be looking to do differently, that we're not doing it now, but maybe you see something that we could do differently?
Well, One of the focuses that USAE has always is in giving back. My late wife was, and she got quite a few honors for having done this, but she was always working to make the community better. So in her case, the various foundations always have these fundraising dinners. Well, Anne was always sort of, an ex post facto member of any fundraising committee. And she would sell tables like nobody's business.
Wow.
So she sold tables to everybody. And she just took it as her job to sell tables. And so whether it was she had been involved in the ASAE Foundation, what do they call their dinner that they have every October,
The class. The Summit Awards.
the Summit Awards, and helped publicize the Summit Awards from year one. Every year she was on their committee. Even when she was sick, she was serving and selling tables for ASAE. And our own company always bought one table, and would bring clients, but she would sell as many as she could for ASAE. She sold tables for PCMA. She sold tables for the Destinations International Association's Spirit of Hospitality event. And it was just something she felt it was really important. And then uh, after she passed away, I felt to sort of I'm not into selling tables, but I felt my contribution should give them some serious real dollars that they can use these real dollars to bring scholars uh, to these conventions. So in the case of Destinations International, I gave them a very large sum of money, uh, along with a contribution every year for a few years, so that they wouldn't have to touch the principal, and to use the interest from this contribution to bring, I think, in the case of Association of the 30 under, in the case of Destinations International, they call it 30 under 30. So the association finds 30 young people who work for CVBs to bring them to the convention using this scholarship dollar. At ASAE, they do the ASAE Foundation brings five people to come to the convention, gives them a $5,000 scholarship to pay for their travel and their hotel uh, and their convention registration, and I think a couple of other educational opportunities throughout the year that if they otherwise hadn't gotten this scholarship, they couldn't be there. So
Right.
in Cleveland, I had the chance to meet 3 of the 5 people who happened to win the scholarship. And it really was very, very heart satisfying to see a real person right in front of me who I knew would not have been there if it hadn't been for the dollars that, Anne and I provided. And it's the same thing with Destinations International. It's a way of helping the whole association community grow and be, uh, learn what the business is about as a person who's just getting involved, because you never know. It's like tossing a pebble into a stream. You never know into a lake. You never know the ripples that you have created by allowing somebody to go to a convention that otherwise wouldn't be there. And who do they meet, and what do they learn, and where do they go in their life? It's a very, very it's a real heartwarming kind of thing.
It is. And I agree with you. I think that is the thing we should do more of. We all talk about mentoring, but how many of us actually do it? I'm an active mentor and work with people when they ask me to, or if they're seeking someone, I'll offer. I think that's great. And I also want to mention the USAE Travel Scholarship for ASAE Annual is great. And 2 of my friends were scholars this year at the Cleveland meeting, Nikki Shanks and Ben Rome. And they are a couple of really great people, really sharp, very talented, and committed to the profession. So that's the sort of door that gets opened.
Yeah, that's what I'm discussing. That's what I was just saying.
Oh,
It's
yeah, exactly.
yeah, it to me it was really, really meaningful to get a chance to meet these folks, because there they are. They wouldn't be there if it hadn't been for the dollars that Anne accumulated over the years, and we gave to ASA to spend in this way.
Yeah, yes, and it's great. And so that's a great thing to encourage more of us to do. Even if we can't endow a scholarship, let's at least help people get there. So, well, Ross, this has been just such a wonderful conversation, especially for me, because I love history, as I know you do. And I have been worrying the last couple of years about the fact that our profession's losing a lot of its history because people are retiring or going on to other things. We're not capturing these great stories. So I want to thank you for joining me for this episode and sharing your stories. And
Been-
before we wrap up, I always like to ask my guests, what is the one thing you would like the audience to take away today? And how could they get in touch with you if they wanted to learn more?
I would say the best thing is to get involved in either ASAE or PCMA or MPI. There's a whole laundry list of associations. The Events Industry Council has them all as members. And so whatever your passion is in the association community or meetings world, pursue it. And if you need to reach me, I'm at usaenews.com. That's our website that we publish. And as well, my email is Ross, ROSS, and you can see it spelled right there, at USAENEWS.com.
That's great. Well, thank you again, Ross. I know I will be inviting you back. I know you have a full schedule, so I hope you can fit us in the future.
Yes. No, I'd be delighted. This has been a lot of fun. And in researching what I wanted to talk about, I realized, heck, I could probably go on with stories for another 3 hours. So I'll let Cecilia figure out what's the next time to invite me to talk about some of
Oh
those.
yeah, I envision a whole series, Ross, seriously, of all the things and the great back end stories, backroom stories, I should say, that you have shared with me about some of the things that have happened that we may not want to actually put on a recording, but we'll find the ones we can.
So you'd have to invite me to a cocktail party, and then that's where you share those kind of tidbits.
Oh, yeah, definitely. When I would love to have a cocktail party. I haven't had one of those for years, so that'd be great. So, well, thank you again,
You're
Ross,
welcome.
for joining me. So we have to go rogue for now, but we'll be back next time with another exciting episode. So again, if you haven't subscribed or followed us yet on your favorite podcast service, please do, because you don't want to miss anything. You definitely don't want to miss the next time Ross comes back.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
So, well, if you'd like to learn more about Rogue Tulips Consulting, you can check out our website, roguetulips.com, and find out how we can help your organization bloom outside the box. If you're interested in CAE education or ethics education, check out our education page. That's our focus, and our fall session starts September 3rd. Plenty of time still to register if you haven't yet. So thanks again, everyone. And on behalf of Ross and myself, we'll see you next time.